160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the sand temperature workers were standing on the day they cracked open the first container, and millions of bees, frozen almost completely solid, spilled out into the most hostile desert on the planet. No hive waiting for them, no flowers, no water source for miles in any direction. Then the researchers walked away and didn't come back for a full year. In 2023, environmental teams across North Africa started asking a question nobody had seriously tried to answer out loud. Could an insect that dies when temperatures cross 104 degrees Fahrenheit somehow become the last thing standing between a dying oasis and total collapse? What they found in the months that followed didn't just surprise them, it forced them to throw out an assumption about desert life that had gone unchallenged for over a century. And the answer wasn't hiding in the heat at all. It was hiding in the dark, in a 3-hour window after sunset that almost nobody had ever bothered to study. Join us, and let's discover what really happens when you drop millions of frozen bees into the Sahara and simply wait. Let's go.
Topic number 13. Saharan bee drop. 160 degrees. That's the sand temperature bees were dropped into, frozen almost solid, cracked out of shipping containers straight into the most hostile desert on Earth. No hives waiting, no flowers, no water. Just containers opened in open sand, then left alone for a full year. Researchers across North Africa had a theory nobody wanted to say out loud. Maybe bees, not tree planting, not irrigation, were the last real defense against dying oases. The math should have killed the idea instantly. Bee colonies start failing once hive temperatures pass 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Saharan summers regularly blow past that number in the shade alone. And the heat wasn't even the worst part. The real killer was silence. Oases losing their thin ring of flowers within weeks, cutting bees off from the pollen network they need to survive. Fewer flowers meant fewer bees. Fewer bees meant fewer seeds. Fewer seeds meant an emptier desert the following year. Scientists have a name for this quiet death spiral, and it never announces itself with a dramatic collapse. A field can still look green while the insects underneath are disappearing one generation at a time. Then thermal cameras picked up something researchers weren't looking for. Ground temperatures during the day were topping 150 degrees Fahrenheit, but a few hours after sunset, that same sand dropped by more than 45 degrees. Inside that narrow gap between blistering heat and total darkness, something in the colonies had already started changing its behavior, and nobody expected bees to be capable of it. What happened next didn't just surprise the researchers watching. It forced them to question an assumption that had never even been on the table. Topic number 12. Yellowstone National Park. Rivers physically changed course because of an animal that never touches water. 41 wolves stepped off trucks into Yellowstone in 1995, and within a decade, the shape of entire rivers had shifted. For nearly 70 years without wolves, elk grazed with zero fear, parking themselves along river banks and stripping saplings down to bare stalks year after year until the banks eroded into the water itself. Once wolves returned, elk herds could no longer sit in one place and eat everything nearby, forcing them to keep moving instead. Willows finally grew tall again, and that gave beavers building material for the first time in decades. A single beaver colony in the entire park grew to 9 and climbing within years. New dams meant new pools, and new pools meant fish, amphibians, and birds returning to stretches of river that had been empty for generations. Scientists call this a trophic cascade, one predator reorganizing an entire ecosystem just by changing how prey animals move. But the story doesn't end on that clean note. New research is now tearing that same conclusion apart, arguing the willows might be responding to something else entirely, something researchers hadn't isolated yet when the wolf story first went viral. If the animal that changed everything wasn't actually the one doing the changing, that question doesn't stay contained to one national park.
Only 1% of people know the dark truth behind what we are about to show you next. If you want to be part of the few who actually know what's happening in the world, subscribe and leave a like right now. Done? Look at this.
Topic number 11. Aral Sea. A fishing trawler sits stranded in the middle of a desert, hundreds of miles from any coastline.
rusting exactly where the water abandoned it. That is not staged. That is Uzbekistan, the dried floor of what used to be one of the 4 largest lakes on the planet. In the 1960s, Soviet planners diverted the 2 rivers feeding the Aral Sea to irrigate cotton fields, a decision made with total confidence and zero modeling of the decades ahead. By the early 2000s, the sea had lost roughly 90% of its volume, splitting into shrinking, disconnected pools. Fishing towns that once supported tens of thousands of jobs found their boats stranded dozens of miles from any shoreline. But the exposed seabed didn't just sit there. Decades of pesticide and fertilizer runoff had settled into that lakebed, and once it dried, desert winds began lifting toxic dust storms laced with the same chemicals that poisoned the water in the first place. Cancer rates and respiratory illness spiked in nearby communities, and the dust didn't stop at the border. Salt and toxic residue from that seabed have been tracked drifting as far as Scandinavia. One river diversion, decided in a planning office, ended up rewriting the air quality of a continent it was never meant to touch. And the fallout from decisions like that rarely stays where the decision was made.
Topic number 10. Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. Wolves now move through a radioactive dead zone in higher numbers than they do in most protected wildlife reserves outside it. After the 1986 disaster forced the permanent evacuation of roughly 1,000 square miles across Ukraine and Belarus, scientists expected silence for centuries. Instead, within years, tracking collars and cameras started recording wolves, lynx, elk, and wild boar moving through abandoned towns in numbers nobody predicted. It has almost nothing to do with radiation being harmless. What actually happened is that humans left completely. No hunting, no farming, no roads, no logging. And for large mammals, that turned out to matter more than the radiation itself. That doesn't mean the radiation vanished. Some studies have found measurable genetic damage and elevated mutation rates in animals closest to the reactor. And researchers remain split on how much of that damage is quietly compounding across generations that haven't been tracked long enough yet. Given a direct choice between chronic invisible radiation and the constant pressure of human development, an entire ecosystem chose the radiation, and nobody built that experiment on purpose.
Topic number 9. Cane toads in Australia. 100 toads were released to eat beetles in 1935. Their descendants now number in the hundreds of millions and cover most of tropical Australia. The toads barely touched the beetles they were imported for, because the beetles live high on cane stalks and the toads can't climb that far. What the toads could do instead was breed relentlessly and produce a toxin lethal to nearly anything on the continent that tried to eat them. Native predators, quolls, goannas, freshwater crocodiles, had never evolved resistance to a poison like it, because nothing like it had existed there before. Some predator populations have crashed by more than 90% in colonized regions, not from competition, but from biting the wrong animal exactly once. And the invasion front keeps moving. Some populations advancing nearly 30 miles a year through the tropical north, a pace that keeps accelerating because natural selection is favoring the toads with the longest legs and the highest tolerance for distance. Researchers studying the frontline animals have found some are now measurably larger and faster than toads from the founding population decades earlier, an invader actively evolving into a more efficient version of itself in real time. And that evolution hasn't slowed down or plateaued at any point since it started.
Topic number 8. China's Sparrow Campaign. Birds were dropping dead out of the sky, mid-flight, unable to land, because villagers wouldn't let them rest. In 1958, China ordered citizens to bang pots and wave flags until Eurasian tree sparrows collapsed from pure exhaustion. Officials blamed sparrows for eating grain and calculated that killing them would raise crop yields. Estimates put the death toll at hundreds of millions of birds within months, entire flocks driven into the ground with nowhere left to land. Nobody accounted for what those sparrows ate the rest of the year. Alongside grain, they consumed enormous quantities of locusts and other crop-destroying insects. With sparrows gutted almost overnight, locust populations exploded completely unchecked.
tearing through farmland with no natural predator left to slow them, arriving right on top of already catastrophic agricultural policy. That combination fed directly into the Great Chinese Famine, one of the deadliest famines in modern history, a death toll historians still argue over, because untangling the campaign's exact share from other failures of the same years is nearly impossible. China eventually reversed course, replacing sparrows with bedbugs on its official pest list, and importing sparrows back in from the Soviet Union to rebuild what it had destroyed. What comes next takes that same mistake, adds airplanes, and stacks 3 separate disasters on top of each other before anyone even realizes what triggered the first one.
Topic number 7. Operation Cat Drop. An airplane released crates of live cats over the jungles of Borneo. And this was not comic relief, it was an emergency rescue mission for villages whose roofs were collapsing under a swarm no one saw coming. In the late 1950s, the World Health Organization sprayed DDT across Borneo to kill malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and it worked, at first. That same spray also wiped out a parasitic wasp that had been the only natural check on a caterpillar species feeding on local thatched roofs. With the wasp gone, caterpillars exploded, and roofs across entire villages began caving in. Then a second wave hit. DDT-poisoned insects were eaten by house geckos, geckos were eaten by house cats, and the cats began dying from poison accumulating up the food chain. Without cats, rats surged unchecked, and rats carried something far more dangerous than a leaking roof, sylvatic plague, straight into villages already stretched thin by a malaria program gone sideways. This is where the scale of the mistake jumps categories entirely, from insects to housing to a disease outbreak threat, 3 separate collapses triggered by one single can of insecticide. The British military's answer was to airlift replacement cats by parachute directly into the affected villages to rebuild a predator population from nothing, and it worked, but only after proving that one chemical decision can rewrite an entire food web from the ground up before anyone even notices it's happening.
Topic number 6. Kudzu vine, American South. Entire buildings have vanished under a single vine that grows up to a foot in one day. Kudzu was imported from Japan in the late 1800s and then actively planted across millions of acres of the American South during the 1930s, promoted by the US government itself as a fix for soil erosion. For a while, it worked exactly as advertised. Then it never stopped. Kudzu has no natural predator or disease anywhere in North America capable of slowing it down, and its growth rate lets it smother native trees by blocking sunlight, killing mature forest canopy within a few growing seasons. By the 1950s, the same government that had promoted the vine reclassified it as a weed, and by 1970 it was formally listed as a federal noxious species. Today, estimates for how much land it covers range from 200,000 acres to 7 million, a gap that wide because nobody has ever finished mapping it. A single overlooked root crown is enough to regenerate the entire plant, which is why removal requires repeated herbicide treatment or manual digging across multiple years, with no guarantee it worked the first time. The fix the government handed out for free is now one of the most expensive invasive species problems in American history, and it still hasn't been solved.
Topic number 5. Great Green Wall of Africa. Only 4% of an 8,000-kilometer wall of trees stretching across the entire width of a continent actually exists today. Launched in 2007 to stop the Sahara from expanding south from Senegal to Djibouti, the project ran straight into a mistake smaller desert projects had already made for decades. Large-scale tree planting in arid zones frequently drains underground water reserves so aggressively that it accelerates the very desertification it's meant to stop, and entire sections of the wall died from exactly that. Where trees did survive, some projects introduced non-native species that altered soil salinity, making the ground harder for anything, including native plants, to grow back. But in a handful of regions, particularly parts of Niger and Ethiopia, an approach with no funding announcement and no media coverage quietly worked. Farmers simply protected the root systems of trees already regenerating naturally in their own fields,
letting existing vegetation recover instead of forcing new growth into hostile soil. That approach reportedly restored millions of hectares, far more than the flagship tree planting effort managed with a fraction of the money. The most fundable idea on the continent, lost to farmers doing almost nothing but staying out of the way, and the wall itself is still barely 1/25th built.
24 rabbits, released for a weekend of hunting in 1859, triggered what is still the fastest mammal invasion ever recorded on the planet. Australia had no natural predator capable of controlling rabbits at scale, and a single female can produce dozens of offspring in 1 year under the right conditions. By the early 1900s, rabbit numbers were estimated in the hundreds of millions. They're grazing, stripping vegetation across enormous stretches of the continent and pushing several native marsupial species toward extinction by destroying the ground cover those animals needed. Farmers built a rabbit-proof fence stretching over 2,000 miles across Western Australia to physically stop the spread, and rabbits crossed to the other side before the fence was even finished being built. In the 1950s, authorities deliberately released the myxoma virus, a disease specifically lethal to rabbits, and it killed an estimated 99% of infected animals almost overnight. Rabbits evolve fast. Within years, survivors carried genetic resistance, and numbers climbed back toward where they started. A second virus deployed in the 1990s produced the same early success and the same rebound. More than a century and a half after one afternoon of recreational hunting, there is still no permanent fix, and the population from that single release is still being measured today.
Topic number 3. St. Matthew Island reindeer. 29 reindeer became 6,000 in 19 years, then became 42 in a single winter. In 1944, the animals were placed on a remote, uninhabited Bering Sea island to feed a small military installation. With abundant lichen and zero natural predators, the herd's growth was essentially unrestricted, and by the early 1960s, it had ballooned towards 6,000 animals on an island that could not sustain that number indefinitely. Reindeer strip lichen from the ground far faster than it regenerates, and once the island's food supply ran out, there was nowhere left for the herd to expand and nothing left to eat. The winter of 1963 to 1964 delivered an unusually harsh season directly on top of an ecosystem already pushed past its limit. When researchers returned to survey the island afterward, the population had collapsed from around 6,000 down to 42, a die-off exceeding 99% in a single season. It remains the textbook case ecologists use for what happens when a population outgrows the resource base keeping it alive, with nothing standing between explosive growth and near total collapse. And the next case on this list shows that same math still running, right now, underneath an industry worth billions of dollars.
Topic number 2. California almond industry. 2 million bee colonies get trucked into California every single February just to keep one crop from failing completely. Almonds require honeybee pollination for virtually every nut on every tree, making this the largest managed pollination event on the planet and not remotely optional for the industry's survival. The bees keep dying anyway. A parasite called varroa mite has hammered commercial colonies for nearly 2 decades, weakening bees directly and spreading deadly viruses through entire hives, and most commercial colonies cannot survive an infestation without constant chemical treatment. During the winter spanning 2024 to 2025 alone, beekeepers across the United States reported losing around 60% of their colonies in a single season, a number that stunned even veteran apiarists who'd already watched losses climb for years. Wild African bee populations, far less domesticated and far harder to manage commercially, have shown real resistance to the same parasite, with zero human treatment at all. Decades of breeding pushed commercial bees toward higher honey yields and gentler temperaments, optimized entirely for human convenience, and that optimization may have quietly stripped away the resilience wild bees still carry. An industry worth billions of dollars now depends on trucking in an insect that is becoming less capable of surviving without rescue every single year. And the one force holding this entire system together is smaller, quieter,
and far more fragile than almost anyone realizes.
90%. That's the share of pollination in dry ecosystems worldwide that happens after dark, according to recent ecological reviews. And virtually none of it has ever shown up in decades of daytime research. For as long as scientists have studied deserts, they've set up cameras and published findings almost entirely in daylight hours, meaning an enormous share of what keeps these ecosystems alive has been sitting completely outside the data the whole time. Inside the Saharan bee experiment, that exact blind spot cracked wide open. The colonies that survived longest hadn't adapted their bodies to the heat at all. They had rewritten their entire schedule, going dormant during peak daylight and becoming active only in the narrow window after sunset, when ground temperatures dropped by tens of degrees within hours. Desert flowers in the same region had already made the identical shift independently, some species holding pollen later and releasing stronger scent after dark, timing themselves to a pollinator nobody had been tracking. Bees are supposed to be daytime insects, documented that way for over a century of research. Under the exact conditions that should have killed them fastest, they abandoned that identity completely, and it kept them alive. If the surviving colonies rewrote their entire existence around hours nobody was watching, then every desert ecosystem study conducted for the last 100 years may only ever have captured half the story. And nobody yet knows how much of the natural world has been running in the dark this entire time, waiting to be noticed.
If you thought this was terrifying, you are not ready for what they found in the video on your screen. Click it right now. The truth is worse than you think.